Okay, so it's April 23rd. I hope you're all doing okay. This is a short video of about the test questions about returns to scale and imperfect competition in market equilibrium. And we have questions on both the second midterm of the practice exams. Both the second midterm last year and the final had these kind of questions, so I'm going to do both. Let's start with the second midterm from last year. But we first need to really talk about these, we need to talk about the graph itself. So let me remind you how it works. So I really have two graphs here. This one has size of typical firm, and then this graph, which is sort of almost a mirror image graph, but it's flipped this way, is the number of firms. So the degree of returns to scale, when you have constant marginal cost plus a fixed cost, it is going to go down when a firm is bigger. When the amount that the firm is selling is really small, that fixed cost is super important, and being able to produce a little bit more is really helpful. So this returns to scale, remember, is the percent change in output for a given, per percent change in input. Think of a 1% change in input, how much more output do you get? So that's, anyway, that percentage change in output for a percent change in input is much bigger when the firm is small, and then it gets to be a fairly efficient scale, and you're getting close to constant returns to scale. Now, what's a little less obvious is if we look at the degree of returns to scale graphed against number of firms. The more firms there are, the smaller each firm, and therefore the higher the degree of returns to scale. So this is we've labeled this the gamma curve, but, and these guys are just labeling the axis there. So when you have too many firms, each firm is small, so there's a high degree of returns to scale. If there are only a few firms, the firms are big, so there's not much returns to scale. Okay, then what about the mu curve? That's telling us over here how the markup ratio is as a function of number of firms. Remember, the markup ratio is how high you're setting your price relative to marginal cost. So mu is, well, actually mu is price over marginal revenue, and you set marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. And the idea here is if there are a lot of firms, there's a lot of competition, and so you're going to have to set your price lower. But if there are only a few firms, there's not much competition, and you can set your price higher. Of course, this is actually equal to the price elasticity of demand over the price elasticity of demand minus 1. When you have more competition, more firms in the industry, the price elasticity of demand is bigger, so instead of, say, 3 halves, you might have 8/7 or something, and 8/7 is a lot lower than 3 halves. The bigger epsilon is, the smaller mu is. The higher the price elasticity of demand, the closer you set your price to marginal cost. Okay, now one trick that's helpful here is if, and this is an important if the marginal cost isn't changing, you might as well imagine that the marginal cost is 1, and then the height here tells you average cost and price, the height of the equilibrium. And one thing I should have drawn better is actually this is the same height as that. I didn't actually draw it that way, but that's supposed to be the same height because you have one solution for mu and gamma. Now let's go to our comparative static experiment here. Question 7 of the second midterm exam last year says what happens if there's a reduction in the total sales Q of an industry? Okay, so how do we think about this? First of all, when we have size of typical firm on the axis, nothing happens to the gamma-gamma curve because that's really tightly linked to the size of a typical firm. However, over here, when we think of the gamma-gamma curve with a smaller industry, that means any given number of firms now has a smaller size of the typical firm. And a smaller size means they're kind of an inefficiently small size, and it's really helpful if they could expand a little bit. So the degree of returns to scale is going to go up. So here's the gamma-gamma prime curve here. We've got the degree of returns to scale going up. Well, at any given number of firms, simply because each firm is now smaller. We're going to do a similar thing talking about the mu-mu curve. The markup ratio, how high you can set your price above marginal revenue, which equals marginal cost, once you've chosen your price, how high you can set your price is going to depend mainly on the number of firms. So this curve doesn't shift. But what does happen is, with a smaller overall market, any given size of a typical firm means there's room for fewer firms. And so if you have fewer firms, it's going to mean you set your price higher, and that's a bigger markup over the marginal cost. And so we've got mu prime. Now notice both of these shifts tell a consistent story about the level of things here going up. So mu and gamma are going up. The markup ratio of price over marginal cost goes up. The degree of returns to scale goes up. With the markup ratio going up, with marginal cost unchanged, that means the price is going up, average cost is going up. And so, marginal cost is staying the same, but for gamma to go up, the average cost has to go up. And that's because the fixed cost is bulking larger. The fixed cost looks more important now that you've got a smaller industry. And we can read off what's happening to the size of a typical firm. Size of a typical firm has gone down. Okay, so here's size to begin with. Over here, we've got size prime. So the size of a typical firm has gone down. What do we find over here? We've got number of firms, and then we've got number of firms prime. And the way you read this graph, this is 0, so that's a smaller number of firms. So the market has gotten smaller, fewer in this category being sold. Size of a typical firm goes down, so the individual firms shrink, but there's also fewer of them. So the lower size of the market is accommodated partly by smaller firms, but partly by fewer firms, smaller and fewer, and they have a higher price and a higher average cost, as you can see here, because the marginal cost and marginal revenue have stayed the same, but the gamma and mu going up has to imply that average cost and price go up. More degree of returns, higher degree of returns to scale, higher markup ratio. Okay, so that basically answers question 7. Answer B was a lower number of firms and a lower output of the typical firm. That works perfectly well. All right, let's go to the next one. All right, next experiment. Next experiment is question 8 of last year's second midterm. Okay, so it says, what about an increase in the size of the fixed cost? What will that do? Well, we better draw our basic graph again. Here's gamma and mu, and over here we've got size of a typical firm. Here we've got number of firms. Here's the level 1, which is, 1 means average cost and price would be equal to the marginal cost. And then we've got our gamma curve. Degree of returns to scale goes down with size, but for a given market size goes up with number of firms, because more firms means a lower size, and the fewer firms, the higher the markup ratio, and bigger firms implies fewer for a given overall market size. Let's look again at our experiment. So we've got an increase in the size of the fixed cost. So if you think of the average cost over marginal cost, so we've got gamma equals average cost over marginal cost, and what's the average cost? The average cost is the fixed cost plus fixed cost plus marginal cost times the quantity for that firm. I'll use a little q, divided by the quantity, divided by marginal cost, and you work that out, and that gives me fixed cost over quantity times marginal cost plus marginal cost. So anyway, gamma is going to go up with the fixed cost, and that's not surprising. The fundamental reason for increasing returns to scale is the fixed cost. So if the fixed cost gets bigger, then for any given size of the firm, you're going to have a higher gamma. So here's our new gamma prime curve. So an increase in the size of the fixed cost for any given size of firm, gamma has gone up. Now the market size overall is the same, and so that means also for a given number of firms that pins down the size, and you've got a higher degree of returns to scale for any given number of firms. So now we can see a lot of things that have happened. First of all, you can tell that the degree of returns to scale has gone up, the markup ratio has gone up. You can remember that the markup ratio was equal to price over marginal revenue, and that was equal to price elasticity of demand over price elasticity of demand minus 1. So anyway, the prices, they're setting for given marginal cost and equal marginal revenue, they're going to have a higher price, higher average cost. Not terribly surprising with the fixed cost going up. But then, what about the number of firms and size of the typical firm? Okay, so here's the initial number, here's the initial size, and how do things shift? Well, the number of firms with the higher fixed cost goes up, and the size of a typical firm, the number of firms goes down. This is closer to the origin, closer to 0. So you've got fewer, bigger firms here, and these are the sorts of things we probably need to know. Let's look at the answer here. A lower number of firms and a higher output of a typical firm. So you can read that off. Size has gone up. That's the output of a typical firm. Number of firms has gone down, is reduced, going towards the origin. Okay, so let's go on to question 9 on the second midterm last year in 2019. What about a reduction in marginal cost? reduction in marginal cost. Let's do that. Okay. I think I'll get a little faster here. I'm going to try to make this, let me try to make this a little smaller in the hopes that we can get 2 questions on one sheet. Hopefully you can still see it just fine. But anyway, here's gamma and mu. There's the level 1. Here's gamma, gamma over here. We've got gamma, gamma over here. And mu, mu. And mu, mu there. Okay, that's going to be similar each time. Let's look at what our question is. We got to worry about a reduction in marginal cost again. So what do we need to do? Well, here it helps again to write down that with fixed cost and constant marginal cost, gamma was the fixed cost over the marginal cost times Q plus plus 1 actually. And boy, that makes me worry that I made a mistake back here. Let's see if I did make a mistake. We had to have fixed cost. Oh, nope, we had to have that over marginal cost. So that was marginal cost over marginal cost, which is 1. So that's what we're using now. Well, remember how we did it. So we've got fixed cost over Q all over marginal cost, and then marginal cost times Q over Q, the Q's cancel, and then the marginal costs cancel. So here, I didn't write this out very well, but I've got, at the end of the day, I've got fixed cost over Q times marginal cost plus 1. Okay, so if I come here and, I'm back instead, I come up the wrong way. Okay, so here I've got fixed cost over marginal cost times Q plus 1. So notice we've got size of firm here. So size, I could have labeled that Q, right? So that's the size of a typical firm. And here's the number of firms. A little q is probably a bit better label than writing out size. But we're looking at a given size, so we're holding the little q constant, keeping the fixed cost the same, but reducing the marginal cost. So if I reduce the marginal cost, then it's going to mean gamma goes up for any given size. Okay, so we've got gamma, gamma prime. And then we come over here, and we've got to do the same thing. For a given size of firm, you've got the same, for a given number of firms, you've got the same size. And so you have gamma, gamma, gamma prime there going up. Now, and there's no reason for the amount of competition or the amount of the markup ratio as a function of number of firms to have changed. So what do we see here? Well, we can certainly see the markup ratio has gone up. The degree of returns to scale has gone up. That's pretty clear. What about the size of a typical firm? So size, this time I'll label it little q. And with the lower marginal cost, what we're seeing is that the size of a typical firm has gone up, and over here what we can see is there's a number of firms to begin with, and the number of firms goes down. So the reduction in marginal cost has resulted in fewer, bigger firms. Now, one of the things that's not totally clear from this diagram, but we figured it out before, is that with the marginal cost going down, the price is indeed lower. So you're in one of the ways to think about that is, you know, if so the same, well, boy, I'm realizing I went through this before, but I've forgotten a little bit, but I do remember, I'm in lecture, I remember quite clearly that we found that when you're talking about what happens to price and average cost, that the reduction the reduction in marginal cost, the direct effect dominates. So it's and it would be quite surprising if it doesn't. There's that general rule of thumb that most of the time the initial effect dominates. But let me not get into that too deeply, because if I look at the question, it's really just about the number of firms. So the answer is a lower number of firms and a higher output of the typical firm. Okay. The last question on the second midterm last year on this topic was, what about an increase in the price elasticity of demand at each number of firms? So for a given number of firms, where, and I think in the question I actually called this N, I could label this N just as well as hash mark, but anyway, number of firms. What we're interested in is the following. So let me draw it down here. So we'll make a totally new graph down here. Gamma and mu. Here's size. I'll experiment with using N for the number of firms. And here's the level 1. And I've got my gamma curve coming down as firms get bigger. I've got also a gamma curve over here. As there are more firms, the firms are getting smaller. And as there are more firms, the markup ratio, the desired markup ratio goes down. But as if firms get bigger, there are fewer firms, so it implies less competition when you have bigger firms for the same market size, other things equal, but actually other things aren't equal. What we have is a change here. I'll do this one in red. We have a change here that says for any given number of firms, we now have an increase in the price elasticity of demand. And so remember that mu equals epsilon over epsilon minus 1. And if epsilon gets bigger, mu gets smaller. So like the difference between 3/2 and 11/10. 11/10 is definitely smaller than 3/2. So as epsilon gets bigger, mu gets smaller. And we're imagining that epsilon is now bigger at each number of firms, which means mu is smaller. So we have a shift downward in the mu curve. So we've got mu prime, and a given size of firm implies a certain number of firms. So there we go. There's my mu prime over there too. And what you can see is that the markup ratio and the degree of returns to scale have gone down. Since marginal cost isn't changing, that means price and average cost are also going down. And what else can we learn? Well, we can learn what happened to the size of a typical firm. So there's Q. Maybe I should make my descenders less bold. here's the number of firms. Now let's see what happens. We've got bigger firms. Now that there's a higher price elasticity of demand for any N, and we have N go down. So we have fewer bigger firms. This is called the shakeout of the industry. This increase in competition for any given number of firms actually results in a smaller number of firms. But notice that prices are coming down, so there's no reason for consumers to be upset about this. Some firms are going out of business, but the remaining firms are providing things at a lower price. And I say consumers shouldn't be upset, but it might be that they value variety. They're getting a lower price, but they've got somewhat less variety to choose from. Okay, so that's it from the second midterm last year. Let's go on to look at the final exam, these similar kinds of questions. So, final exam last year from 2019 says, in the model of returns to scale and imperfect competition and market equilibrium, what will happen with an increase in the total sales Q of an industry? Okay, so we'll start doing these a little bit faster. And I think you can notice there are only so many variations on a theme. So even though these are very difficult questions, but there aren't that many different types of them. Okay, so let's do this increase in the total sales Q. I think we're at a point where I can draw them a little bit smaller. I'll give a little less commentary, but why don't you try to provide commentary for yourself? That'll be very helpful in learning about this. Okay, now we've got an increase in total sales Q in the industry. That means, well, this curve just really depends on the quantity sold by each firm. But over here, for a given number of firms, they're selling more, and therefore they're going to have a lower degree of returns to scale. Things are, production is less efficient, or the fixed cost doesn't seem as important when you have you have a bigger size, and for a given number of firms you have a bigger size, and the degree of returns to scale is smaller. Okay, then what about the mu mu? Over here, the markup depends mainly on number of firms, so the mu mu doesn't change over here, but over here, for any given size of firms, you've now got room for more firms, which gives you more competition. So we've got the mu mu prime. What do we find? We find the degree of returns to scale goes down, right? You're going to a lower level from there to there. I guess I could, for once, I can graph it explicitly. This here is gamma and mu right there at that level. So, and except that with the orange, the primed version of it is going to be here. So there's gamma prime equals mu prime right there. It's gone down. The degree of returns to scale has gone down. The markup ratio has gone down of price over marginal revenue. What's happened to output? Well, there's Q and number of firms, there's N. How have they changed? Well, the quantity sold by a typical firm has gone up, and the number of firms has gone up further from the origin. So more firms that are bigger. So this, again, notice totally the opposite of what happened when the market shrank. So this is pretty straightforward. And of course, with marginal cost unchanged, this means that the price and the average cost has gone down. Okay. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Well, and of course the answer here is a higher number of firms and a higher output of the typical firm. Now, question 22. A reduction in the size of the fixed cost would do what? Okay, so let's think of a reduction in the size of the fixed cost. Now we've got a lot to graph just to set this up, but here I go, provide your own commentary. All right, let's do our change. We've got the reduction in the size of the fixed cost. The reduction in the size of the fixed cost means the degree of returns to scale is lower for any given quantity. Okay, and given the size of the market, lower for the same quantity also means lower for the same number of firms, because number of firms implies quantity. And so the height we've got here has gone down. So instead of there, we've got this lower level here. So height has gone down, so the degree of returns to scale and the markup ratio have gone down. The market with the fixed costs lower, the market is that much closer. It's a tiny bit closer to being like perfect competition. You know, more firms, as you can see here, and each firm. Well, let's see. So more firms. So we go from n to n prime, and over here, what do we get? We've got the size of a typical firm is little q there. And the size of a typical firm goes down. So we've got fewer firms and more firms. And so, as I said, it's a little bit in the direction of perfect competition. It's still a long, long way away from perfect competition, but just a little bit closer. Okay. Next, we've got an increase in marginal cost. Okay, so this is indeed one of the hardest ones. Okay, so the key thing here is actually that in terms of these graphs, is that with a increase in marginal cost, now the fixed cost looks relatively less important compared to the marginal cost. And so the degree of returns to scale will have gone down. So let's do this in purple. So the degree of returns to scale goes down because relative to the marginal cost, the fixed cost is now less important. You've got a higher marginal cost. Fixed cost is actually the same, but it's less important relative to marginal cost. So the degree of returns to scale goes down. What happens? Well, you can see that the degree of returns to scale for a given quantity goes down, and for a given number of firms, but you can see actually that in equilibrium, it also goes down. You started out at this level of gamma and mu, and now you're going down to this lower level of gamma and mu. So gamma and mu go down, and let's diagram what's happening to the quantity and the number of firms. What's happening is the quantity sold by a typical firm has gone down with this, and the, oh no, I can't believe I did that. This was the initial n, and then this is the new n. Okay, so we've got, I did it right over here, but there's a, by the way, every time I make a mistake, it's better for me to make the mistake than you to make the mistake. Notice what mistakes are easy to make and try to get it straight. So the quantity sold by a typical firm goes down, and there are now more firms. So you have more smaller firms now that marginal cost is higher, because the fixed cost is less important. And actually, interestingly enough, with this higher marginal cost, it's just a little bit like going a tiny bit in the direction of perfect competition. You know, if marginal cost were the only thing, that would be perfect competition. But if the but here, even though there is a fixed cost, if the marginal cost becomes more important, you do get more firms and smaller firms. Okay, and again, let me simply assert that I'll think about this a little bit more, but let me assert that if the marginal cost is increasing, that will indeed make the price and average cost go up, despite the fact that that gamma and mu have gone down. Okay, now we come to the last one of this type, and the last one for this video. What about a reduction in the price elasticity of demand at each number of firms n? Okay, so let's, again, I'm going to make my graph without too much comment, because you should now be thinking about why I'm doing each thing. Okay, let's look at our experiment here. Price elasticity of demand is now lower at each number of firms n. Remember that mu was equal to epsilon over epsilon minus 1. If epsilon goes down, mu goes up, because it's like going from 11/10 to 3/2, and 3/2 is bigger than 11/10. So if epsilon goes down, mu gets bigger. So we've got a bigger mu at any given number of firms. Let's do this in red. A bigger mu at any given number of firms, so that's a mu prime that looks like this. Okay, and a given size implies a given number of firms. So for a given, because we're not changing the total size of the category, so we got mu prime there. Now, first thing to notice is what's happening to the markup ratio itself. Mu equals gamma there. Now with the red, it's gone up. Markup ratio has gone up. Mu prime equals gamma prime. Now, marginal cost hasn't changed, so we know that price and average cost have also gone up. And what's happened to our quantity and number of firms? So this time I'll try to do it right. Here's the quantity beforehand and the number beforehand. Then we go to the number after looks like more firms, or from there to there, more firms, and each firm is now smaller. Okay, so does that make sense? What we have is we actually have this market becoming less competitive for a reason that doesn't have anything to do with the number of firms, or for any given number of firms, it's becoming less competitive. So as it becomes less competitive and the prices can go up, now you're winding up with entry of more firms, with each firm producing less. So it's the opposite of a shakeout. Having it be less competitive makes it attractive for lots of small competitors. Of course, everybody's getting small. Okay, so that's good for that. This is an important type of question, and remember why this was so important. I mean, we really wanted to understand how the economy really is. This is realistic in the business context. The imperfect competition is important for price stickiness being plausible. I mean, you have a lot of increasing returns to scale was important when we talked about growth theory. Just how much extra mileage can we get from increasing the saving rate? So there are a lot of reasons this is important, but I just think it will help you think about the real world. That's the main thing. And definitely more to think about on this, but I think this is a good for now. So thanks for listening, and stay safe.